Hi, I'm Sophia, and this is the Geek Group and our next lesson on sewing. I'm going to start with the tools you'll need for today's activity. First, you need a pair of really good scissors. I've already talked about these scissors in the other videos, so I'm not going to talk about them again, except to say they're very, very sharp and dangerous, and someone could lose an eye. So I will be careful. I also need my snips for cutting thread, because you don't want to use your good scissors to cut thread or you'll make your good scissors go dull, and they're really hard to sharpen. Thread cutting. I've got two kinds of pins, and this time I'm really going to need both kinds, both the kinds with hearts and the kinds that are just regular pins. I'm going to need a seam ripper like last time, because just like last time I made a mistake and I needed a seam ripper. I'm going to need two colors of chalk this time, because I have both a dark piece of fabric and a light piece of fabric, and I'll need chalk to go with. I'm also going to be putting in some elastic this time instead of a drawstring. Elastic is just like a drawstring, except that you finish it off at the end. I've got my bias tape. This is the double wide bias tape. Extra double wide. And notice that it is double folded as well. That's very important for today's activity. I've got my safety pin. I've got my measuring tape this time, and my safety dinosaur. And I may be using an iron and ironing board as well. Today we're going to talk about making a different kind of skirt. Last time we made a skirt out of a circle tablecloth, and this time we're going to make a skirt out of two other skirts. Now, the reason for this activity is you may find a skirt that you really, really love, but it's way too small for you. Or you may have a skirt or a piece of fabric that you really, really like, but something happened to it. Either you dropped some coffee on it, it's been stained beyond all repair, a wild dog attacked you and put a hole in the bottom, you ripped a piece of it off in a door. These are all things that happen to real people. But you don't have to throw away that piece of clothing that you really, really love. You just make it into something else. Today's skirt is going to be a very basic design, and in addition to making the casing that we did last time, we're also going to work on straight seams and finishing. I've got my pen and paper here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what the shapes are for today. Now, the two skirts that we're going to be cutting up are rectangular in nature. Both of them are two giant rectangles sewn together on the sides with elastic at the top and open at the bottom. This is a really good shape if you're tall and thin like this. In fact, really tall, skinny people without hips look great in a giant rectangle. They look fantastic. But not all of us were shaped this way. I am not shaped this way. I'm more curvy. If you're a curvy person, you're going to want to make some adjustments to this pattern, and I'm going to talk about those too. If you're a curvy person like this, and we're talking some childbearing hips here, then you're going to want to change this shape just a little bit to be narrow at the top and wider at the bottom. This is a little more complicated. You'll notice you have to cut the ends off here to bring them up a little bit on either side. You don't want this. It'll give you a shape that is not the shape you're looking for. It's more of like a rough edge to the bottom. If you want an even bottom that's along the, with an even flat line, you actually have to bring these up a little bit to compensate for the hips. So I'm going to show you how to make this one with the pieces that we're using, but I'm actually going to make that one. I've got two skirts that I'm going to be working with today. The first one looks like this. It's kind of cute. It's kind of ruffly. It's got a drawstring waist with elastic inside. It's made out of 100% cotton. I know that because it says so right here on this tag. And it's also lined, which means I'm going to have to do a little prep work before I get started on actually sewing or cutting it in order to secure the lining to the outside for the use of our activity today. And I'll do that in a minute. I could also just discard the lining, but I like the lining, and it makes a better garment when you have lining, so I'm going to keep it. The other skirt I'm going to be using is a lot longer, but it's also damaged at the top. It's rayon, which means that it is a synthetic fabric that mimics cotton, and it has been worn through in the top. There are some darts up here, and you probably can't see them on the camera, but the threads have survived and the fabric is starting to give up the ghost. It's really starting to pull. If I were to wear this for any length of time, I'd probably put holes in the top fabric. It's just worn through. So what I'm going to do is, because the bottom of this fabric is just fine, I'm going to be using the bottom. I'm going to discard the top since it's damaged, but I'm going to use the bottom. And this is how you can prolong the life of the clothes that you love. You can make them into something else. I'm not going to do that just yet. I have to get the pink skirt ready first. So I'm going to move over to the sewing machine to do that now. This is the sewing machine that I'm going to be using. It's much more advanced than this project requires. I'm basically going to start with just a plain straight stitch. I'm not going to do anything fancy. Usually the straight stitch is the first option on any machine that you're using, but it's the one that doesn't look like a zigzag. It just goes in a straight line. I'm using white thread so that you can see what I'm doing on the fabric that I'm using. Now, this skirt has a drawstring, and I'm going to carefully avoid it. I'm actually going to cut this elastic part off later. There are a couple of things I need to pay attention to before I sew the lining and the outside together. The first thing I need to pay attention to is that the lining is flat on the inside. I want to make sure that it's not bunched up, and I'm going to do that by pulling on it from the far side. So I'm going to pull on the far side and make sure that it's flat. I can also feel the flatness with my fingers here. I'm just going to sew all the way around just under the inserted elastic. I'm going to put this machine on fast because I'm not doing anything fancy, and I'm a really good sewer. If you're not a good sewer or you're new to sewing, don't do it on fast. It'll get away from you, and you'll make all kinds of curvy lines. It'll be all wiggling. You might run over your hand. It could be bad. Medium or slow is good to begin, but I'm up to fast. I'm just following with the foot against the elastic that's on the skirt. That makes it easy. And I'm checking every once in a while. I don't have to be super careful because I'm not expecting this clothing to last me through the apocalypse. Okay. This is me reaching for my snips. You can see that what I did here is I sewed just along the top edge. And by doing that, I sewed the lining to the outside of the skirt. Now I'm going to cut off the elastic. And even though I've been doing this forever, I'm going to move this skirt from underneath because with my luck, I'd cut through both skirts. So now we can see the shape of this skirt a little bit better. It's basically a rectangle. It does get wider towards the bottom because it has these ruffles in it, and that increases the bottom, but the ruffles are also rectangles. I want this skirt that I'm going to be making to have 4 pieces. So I need to cut this one right down the line of the seam. I'm actually going to pin the lining to it so that they go together. I'm more or less making sure that the seam of the lining and the seam of the outing part is lined up. And I don't even need it to be perfect because nobody's going to see the lining but me, and I'm going to treat it like it's one piece of fabric. I'm going to leave those pins in there so that it doesn't move around. This is how I'm lining up those 2 seams. So I see the seam here and I see the seam here, and I just lay them on top of each other. I can feel them through the fabric as well. I'm not being super careful about it because it's not important. Or rather, I should say, it's not important to me. If you're the sort of detail person that really, really cares about that stuff, you can spend more time to make it perfect. And that way, your brain won't hurt. But if you're me, those details are not as important. Okay, so I now have 2 pieces of this bright pink skirt. I have this piece, and I have this piece. For the purposes of this activity, I want to use the bottom half of this skirt. It's actually got slits in it, right here. so I don't have to cut that part. It doesn't have a lining either, so I don't have to be so careful with pinning. I can more or less just cut. It's a rectangle, so that's easy. But I actually want it to be the same length as the pink skirt. And the way I'm going to know how long to make it are two ways. You could measure it. I could take a tape measure, and I could measure from here to there. Which is just about 20 inches. And then I can measure 20 inches on this one and cut it there. Or, because I like to be fast, I'm just going to lay this one on top. I'm going to line up the bottoms, and then I'm just going to cut. You can see now that this one does get wider at the bottom. That is the shape that you want if you are a curvy person. Notice the similarity. This one goes straight out from the side, and this one goes out like that. So I've lined up the bottom here, and it doesn't need to be perfect, of the bottom piece, the top piece, and the pink one. You can make it perfect if you want to. And then I'm just going to cut straight across. Because I need 4 pieces for this project, I'm now going to cut the side seams on this one. Now, this particular skirt had a back seam, so I'm going to make this the back of my skirt. There's a seam down the middle of it. I could put it in the front, but I like it better in the back. Now, what I'm going to do now is sew all of these pieces of fabric together in alternating stripes. So I'm going to have a flower one, and then I'm going to sew a pink one to that. And then I'm going to sew a pink one to the other side and a flower one. And that way, I will end up with a skirt that's got flowers in the front and back and ruffles on the either side. And that way, it'll be interesting and clever, and I've used all this fabric. So I'm going to actually sit down over here to pin these together, and I'm going to sew them a piece at a time. So I only need 2 to start. When I pin these together, I have to make sure that right sides are together. We're going to be doing a straight seam, and I want to make sure that the right side, the pretty side of this fabric with flowers, and the right side, meaning the side with the ruffles of this pink fabric, are together. That way the seam will be pretty on the pretty side, and it won't be pretty on the back. So that's what I'm going to do first. What I have here is the top of the fabric. I know it's the top because the bottom has a hem on it already. And I usually lay that out in my lap. Then I've got the right side up, the flower pretty part up. Then I'm going to take this fabric, and this is the right side. That's the wrong side. This is the right side. It's got the ruffles. So I'm going to put that face down on the pretty side of the other fabric. Pretty sides together. I'm going to line up the tops. So I have the flower one on the back and the pink one on top. I'm going to line them up together and I'm going to pin them. I'm sewing 3 pieces of fabric together because I have the 2 pieces that make up my skirt and the lining. I didn't manage to cut it perfectly. You can see that this green one is a little bit longer than the pink one. I think I'm probably going to adjust for that. I'd rather cut off the top than the bottom because the bottom already has the hem. So I'm going to make adjustments to that. I'm just going to go back up the line. This kind of thing happens all the time. It's really hard, even when you're using a pattern, to cut everything exactly right. You have to decide if you're going to cut and adjust things at the bottom or the top. You generally want to adjust things wherever it's easiest. I probably could have gotten a more accurate cut if I had done the measuring, but the measuring takes a really long time. And for the purposes of a garment that I know is made out of used materials and won't last forever, I'm probably not going to put the time in. But it's totally up to you. Now I'm going to double check it. It looks like I've managed to completely include the lining, which is good, all the way down, and I've got it sewn there. Now I'm going to end up sewing along this piece right here. Once again, you are absolutely supposed to remove your pins as you sew. This time I'm going to remove the pins just to show you what it's like. I don't normally do this even though you're supposed to. This rayon is not cooperating. It's much more flexible than the pink cotton underneath, and so I'm really having to zhuzh it to get it to lie flat. That's because it's stretching, and this happens. It's a lot more flexible in a weave than the cotton is. there's my knot at the end where I zigzag back and forth. Now, the advantage of taking out all your pins as you go is that you're done. All the pins are out when you're done. And this is what it looks like on the wrong side. And this is what it looks like on the right side. Nice and neat, nice and clean. Now, there's only one thing that we have to do, especially because we're using rayon, which frays really easily. You can see it here. We're going to zigzag this to secure it. You have to use a different stitch. Instead of using the straight stitch, you're going to use the zigzag stitch. Now, different machines have different ways of setting the zigzag. You'll need to look up what your machine needs to happen to make it a zigzag. On this one, I just press a button. Done. And now I'm going to zigzag from the top to the bottom. I don't need to pin again because it's already sewn in place. I do, however, want to go as close to that line that I sewed as I can. And I think I'll go from the other direction so that you can see what I'm doing. The thread is white and it'll show up really nicely against the pink background. So we'll start with that. I'm going to speed this up because I don't need to be super careful. At the beginning and the end there, I'm just running back and forth to lock the stitch. You don't actually have to do that on zigzag, but I do. You do have to do a zigzag on most things. That's all I'm going to say. Like, there are exceptions, but the exceptions are too long to explain to you at this time. And if you're a beginning sewer, you're not going to have those exceptions. It's really important to do this, otherwise your fabric unravels and it'll just pull out, usually while you're wearing it. If you've ever bought a piece of clothing that wasn't very expensive and sat down and a seam ripped, that's what happened. They didn't have a good enough end locking stitch on the end, which is this zigzag stitch. So I now have some of my skirt. This is going to be the front and the side, and now I need to sew together the back and then the last side. I'm not going to really explain this next piece because I'm just going to be doing what I just was doing before. I'm going to do it 2 more times. Double check to make sure I have right sides together. This time, because I know it's a problem, I'm going to start from the bottom. The more advanced a sewer you are, the fewer pins you need. If I didn't have 3 pieces of fabric, the third one being the lining, I probably wouldn't use pins at all. I'd just eyeball it. But when you're first starting, you just can't do that. Your skill's just not there yet. That time I totally sewed over the pins. I'm just checking that nothing's caught underneath. It's really smooth. All the buttons on this machine are different from the one I have at home, so I keep going for the wrong space. So far, I have a flower panel, and a pink panel, and a flower panel. Right sides together. Sometimes you don't see me checking because I can feel if there's a fold of fabric back there with my fingertips by pressing down on the plate here. Okay, I only have one more straight seam to do. I've got a lot of fabric in my lap. This is going to be a really full skirt. But I've got a flower panel, and a ruffle panel, and a flower panel, and a ruffle panel. I happen to know that this is going to be the back because it has the seam. So I'm going to close the loop, and I'm going to be careful that I didn't twist the fabric accidentally somehow. Mostly I do that by laying it out. Here's the last one. And then I'm just going to put a casing on the top like we did last time. After I trim up some of those edges, I'm going to put some elastic in it and we'll be done. This skirt style is really versatile. You can add pockets, you can add a ruffle to the bottom. You have lots of options, and that makes a really different skirt. I am giving myself a huge seam allowance, mostly because I have to deal with all the raw edges on the two skirts that I'm working with. When you're doing this, it's good to have extra fabric, especially if it's your first time, and to give yourself a big seam allowance on the side. The seam allowance is this part right here, between where you're sewing and the edge of the fabric. Okay, back to the main table to trim some things up. The first thing I'm going to trim is this edge right here. Let me show you on the pink side so you have a chance to see what I'm talking about. I don't need anything beyond the edge of this zigzag right there. So the zigzag goes along here, and I can cut all of the rest off. I'm going to do that on all 4 seams. The next thing I have to do is sort of fix up this top part because I cut the floral one a little too long. Quite frankly, I'm just going to eyeball it. I feel confident about eyeballing it because I'm a visual spatial learner. I'm really good at imagining things in 3 dimensions, and I'm really good at seeing things in 3-dimensional space. So I can be quite accurate. If you're not that kind of learner, though, especially if you're a logical mathematical learner and you really like things to be precise, don't do it this way. It'll make you crazy. Okay, so now I have this giant tube. Whew, that is a lot wider than the circle skirt that we made. What I'm going to do next is to put a casing on the top of this. I'm going to do the 1-step casing this time, and I'm going to show you how that works. So here we go. This is my bias tape. We're going to use it in a slightly different way. Now, I'd like you to notice it's 3 yards. This is not 3 yards, but it could be kind of close. Now, we know that this piece that has the seam down the middle is the back, so that's where we're going to start. Once again, we've got the bias tape like last time. This one's thicker. There are some things I want to point out about this bias tape. Once again, you've got a long side and a short side. And there's a reason that it's been designed that way. So there's a long side and a short side. We need to make sure that the short side is on the good part of the fabric. So if I were to lay my fabric out on the table like this, I'm going to make sure the short side is up, and I'm going to put it over the fabric like so. So I'm putting it around the fabric. One side is underneath the fabric, and one side is on top, like that. The shorter side is on top. And then I'm going to pin it. I'm going to pin it all the way around. This is the one-step process. Now, in order to do this, you need to make sure that you can sew pretty close to the edge pretty consistently. That's what it looks like. Sorry, let me do that on the table so you can see. So I'm opening the bias tape up. I'm laying the fabric in it. It's just rectangles together. Geometry again. And then I'm going to pin it. I'm opening it up. I'm laying the fabric in it. And I'm closing it back up again. Now, the reason it's so important that you have the shorter side up is you can see that this pin is really close to the edge of the bias tape. But if you look on the back, it's not nearly so close to the edge of the bias tape. And that's going to make sure that we get the tape on both sides when we sew it down. The skirt we're making today, with these 4 rectangles sewed together, is a pretty traditional skirt. It's the skirt that has been worn by women since long before Victorian times, but it became really popular in Victorian times. Only in Victorian times, that whole tube would be 10 yards. There'd be 10 yards of fabric. That's 30 feet. We're not doing quite 3 yards. You can see it didn't really matter that the top of this was cut perfectly smooth because it's all being hidden by the binding. when I'm making Victorian gowns and I have a really big skirt that I have to pin, I literally run out of pins and I have to do it half at a time. I have to pin half and then sew it and then take all the pins out and use them the second half. I'm not helping by doing this in my lap. The nice thing about the one-step binding process versus the two-step process is that it's shorter. Like I'm only going to sew one more thing on here and then put the elastic in and we're done. So that's nice. It can be messier. You need more skill because you have to run it along the edge of the fabric and that can be difficult, especially if you're a beginner. Phew, I have enough binding. Okay, so I want to go a little bit further than the one I have down so that I can cover it up. I'm going to cut it. This time I only need to fold it once. Last time we folded it twice, but this time I only need to fold it once. And I'm going to do this corner thing that will make it neat on the side facing me. That's the corner thing. I just folded in this corner. This bias tape is stiff because it's been starched within an inch of its life. And the stiffness will go away when you wash it. I'm zhuzhing, sort of slipping them together and pinning them in place so it's nice and neat. Now, this is where you really need the two pretty pins because we have to leave an opening to put the elastic in. And the way you're going to know to stop in time, actually I'm going to zhuzh this a little bit better. The way I'm going to know when to start and stop is because of the heart pins. I'm going to know that when I see a heart pin, that's where I'm going to stop, and that's where I'm going to start. I have red ones. Red is for stop. Green is for go. How about that? See that, kids at home? Green is where we're going to start. We're going to go all the way around and stop at red. Adorable, right? Okay. The trick here is to stay as close to the edge, this brown edge, as I can, so I have lots of room for the elastic. I'm actually going to slow the machine down. I'm going to make sure that I'm on a straight stitch instead of the zigzag stitch, which is the last thing I used. I'm going to double check there's no fabric underneath. It's all smooth sailing from here. And I'm going to back up to lock it in place. I'm putting a little tension on it. That means pulling the fabric towards me so that it feeds into the machine really smoothly. The only problem with this technique is if I am not really good at going straight, I can drive right off the edge of this brown fabric and then I have to start over, and if I want it to look nice, I have to get out the seam ripper and pull all those stitches out. This style that we're making now, because it's a shorter skirt, it's not full length like the Victorian ones, it's actually a 50s style. Today, instead of doing skirts in the rectangular pattern shape, we often do the more triangular one that I showed you for curvy girls. Coming up to my red heart pin, and that means I need to stop. I also need to take out all my pins. Now here I have a bucket of pins. Back home I have a giant magnet, which I find really useful because it forces the pins to go in one of two directions, and then all the heads are in the same space. All right, I'm going to move back over to the table and talk to you a little bit about how you can adjust this pattern if you don't want to use rectangles. Instead, you want an A-line skirt, a skirt that is narrower at the top than at the bottom. What we have here are four more or less giant rectangles. The pink one does spread out a little towards the bottom. But if I really wanted an A-line skirt, I would want the top to be a lot narrower. In that case, I would cut from here to that corner. So I want it to be as wide as possible on the bottom, and I want it to be narrow enough at the top that it'll fit around my hips, but I want it to get wider towards the bottom. In that case, before I sewed any of these pieces together, I would have cut them like this instead of in rectangles. In the floral piece, I might start here and cut all the way on the diagonal. Now, if you are doing that, you actually want the pieces all on top of each other so that the diagonal is the same. In that case, I would have folded them and laid them all on top of each other so the edges that I'm cutting in the diagonal are all on top of each other, and then I would have cut them all at the same time. I can do that because of these awesome scissors. So that's how you would make this adjustment if you have really wide hips and you want a look that's more flattering. Because this is going to be gathered at the top, it'll look good on almost anyone. If I were to twirl around in this skirt, it'll go out like that into a bell and then straight down. If I were to twirl around in an A-line skirt, it just flinks out to the side. Very flirty if you're into swing dancing. So the last thing that I need to do is to put in my elastic. My elastic's going to go in that opening that I left in the fabric right there. There's the opening. I can put my thumb in there. And you can see here that I did a really good job of catching the top and the bottom of the bias tape. I had to do that all the way down, the top and the bottom. I missed it here, and I'm going to have to go back and catch that one once the elastic's in. I'm going to double check that I caught the bottom all the way around before I go any further, and I can see clearly that I did. Now, I got this elastic. This is a non-roll elastic. It has these ridges in it that prevent it from curling up on itself inside the casing, which is much more comfortable. It's a little more expensive, but it's worth it. This is what it looks like. So you can recognize non-roll elastic from rolling elastic. It's got these ridges. See those ridges, overhead camera? There, you see them? Very stretchy. This is 3/4 inch elastic, and I'm a little worried that it won't fit inside my casing. So I got smaller elastic, but I'm going to try it first. We're going to use the same technique that we used last time with the ribbon. I'm just going to test it really quick before I cut. Yeah, this elastic's a little too wide, and I was worried about that already. So I am prepared with slightly thinner elastic. Give me a second to grab it. Okay, now clearly I'm not as wide as this skirt is, so I need to measure my elastic. You want your elastic to be not the actual measurement of your waist. If you do that, it'll be too loose. So you actually want to put it around your waist, like so. The part of your waist you're actually going to wear the garment, and then you want to kind of pull it tight. So that's my waist right there. And it looks like I'm going to have it like this. I've pulled it tight. Like if I were to let it loose, it wouldn't quite fit all the way around, but because I'm pulling it, it does. That's the nice thing about elastic. I'm going to leave a little bit extra right there to do the sewing, just in case. Remember, measure twice, cut once. And now I'm just going to feed this all the way through the whole skirt. Before I do that, I'm going to actually take the safety pin because it'll poke me less often, and I'm going to safety pin this elastic to the seam, which is the strongest part, because I don't want the elastic to go in one side and all the way through and out the other. I want only one end to do that, and I want to be able to grab both ends at the end. Okay. So now I'm going to squish the elastic. I'm going to grab the head of the safety pin inside the casing and pull. Grab and pull. The bigger your safety pin, the faster this goes. Although you have to have a safety pin that fits in the casing. So I've now more or less taught how to do a casing and a straight seam and how to zigzag the edge of the straight seam to secure it. Next time I'm going to teach you how to do a rolled hem, which you actually already did without thinking about it. And then you will know the 3 things that you need to know to do almost everything in sewing. There's a little bit more I could teach you about doing sewing around curves. And if there's time, we're going to do a lesson on that too while I'm here visiting from California. But if you only had these 3 techniques, you would be able to make a ton of things. You could be confident that you could pick something out at the fabric store, a pattern, and you could follow the instructions and it would come out okay. See how gathered this is going to be? It's going to be super gathered. I'm like not even halfway through. I think I may take this over to the chair so I can sit down. Okay. I'm going to let the camera come in here. And what I want to do is bring the safety pin back out this gap right here. And there it is. The 2 safety pins meet. It's love at first sight. Okay. When you're taking this safety pin off, you have to be really careful, or you will lose that piece of elastic faster than you can say jack. And then you'll have to start all over. So sometimes it's worth it to pull the elastic out a little before undoing the safety pin so there's no tension on the elastic. And then as soon as you let go of that safety pin, you pick up the elastic. All right, I'm going to hold on to these. And give myself some room. The other thing I'm checking is to make sure the elastic hasn't flipped over while I was threading it through the casing. You want to make sure that when you do finally sew these together, that you are sewing the tops to the top. You kind of just have to eyeball it. I almost did it wrong there. So this edge is going along there. Let me do it here. This edge is going along there, and this edge is going along there. I'm going to sew these 2 together, and then I'm going to close this up. I gave myself lots of space. You can see it's not going to be a very tight skirt. I could make it tighter just by shortening the elastic once I've got it in there. I'm going to try that again because the threads seem to be unhappy for some reason. Could mean I need a new needle. It could mean that I need to rethread the machine, which I think I will do anyway because it's smart. Just going to go over it one more time. I'm going back and forth to secure those ends. I want that stitch to be really strong. It's going to get a lot of weight on it. And now I'm going to tuck the elastic inside. So I may snip off those parts I don't need. I'm also going to tuck in the fabric that has been in there this whole time. And it's going to look like it's going to be really lumpy. But when it's all tucked in, it's going to look like that. And then I'm going to pin it just to make sure. I'm pinning right through the elastic. And because I missed this piece here when I was first sewing, I'm going to start there and pin that down, even if I sew the elastic in. Now, you'll notice I'm actually pulling on the fabric, on the elastic, to stretch it out straight. And the last thing I need to do is make sure that it picked up on the other side, which it did. Normally, you would want to use thread that's the same color as the fabric underneath. We are not, so that you can see what we're doing. There it is. That's the good side. And our second skirt is done. I haven't snipped any of the ends yet. This is the back. We know because it's got the seam down the back. If I were to flip it over, that's what people will see in the front. And you can see it's got the flirty little ruffles on the side. It's gathered around the waist. I could have used that trapezoid shape if I wanted to reduce the amount of fabric around the waist. But for right now, this is a really good piece. There we go. Our second skirt of the day. You can even find out even more at the Geek Group. Thanks and see you next time.
This video was made possible by a grant from the Future Girl Foundation.
This video was made possible by thousands of private donations from members and viewers like you. Please visit thegeekgroup.org for more information on how you can donate and become a part of our dreams of Avalon.